Welcome back, Phil. It's nice to see you again.
It's nice to see you, Keith. It's nice. Cheers.
Second, I'm
Cheers.
with a takeaway
I've got
today.
my Grimsby Town mug today. That'll be esoteric knowledge for most people. But
Super.
if anybody identifies with that, I'm very happy.
Well, we said we'd go with CLIL, what's in it for the subject teachers, what's in it for the language teachers today. And we've actually got a contributing question from a colleague, which we'll get to at some point. And I thought perhaps it'd be interesting for us to start at there's a link with you and me doing a co-plenary in an event in Madrid. It was a British Council school. I think it's called the Bilingual School of Madrid these days, in 2013, where I spoke about really what language is in it for the subject teachers. And you spoke about what CLIL is in it, what content is in it for the language teachers. And you mentioned conceptual sequence in there. And the frog, I think you mentioned the frog at that event as well. And I think my understanding has evolved a little bit because when I spoke at that event about what's in it for the subject teachers, I talked about language levels, subject specific language, general academic language, and then this kind of classroom organizational language. That stayed the same for my understanding for the subject teachers. It's kind of making that language salient for their learners so that they can take it on.
Yeah.
But I wondered if your take on what's in it for the language teachers has changed much over the years.
No, it hasn't changed. Whether the world of language teaching has changed or not is another question.
Yeah.
Perhaps that'll come in with Isabella's question that you said. Well, I
Yeah.
think it has changed. I think it has changed a little bit, but I don't. I think we've got to be careful not to be
Yeah.
overcritical here, and also, I do remember all those days going to IATEFL meetings and feeling a little bit kind of marginalized by it all, thinking, what's going on here?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I always felt that the message that you just mentioned there could have come into those. Maybe it does more now. I haven't been for a couple of
No,
iterations,
I'm not
but
sure.
it's difficult. Well, I mean, we can get onto that, I think. But I this idea that this idea about professional development, people talk a lot about PD, has to surely involve this, I think. And it seems to be an obvious element for language teaching PD to consider, as you said,
Yeah.
the shape of content or how content behaves.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
the only way that language teachers see the way that content behaves is the way that a textbook will provide it for them.
Yeah.
We've already been sort of inverted commas critical about that, but then again, we understand. I think the CLIL world also understands you know,
Yeah.
the way that textbooks do cater for certain situations, circumstances around the world, and I don't think you can argue against that. But there is, I think, a bit of shape for this. So basically, I think the idea is that, or what we're saying is, and CLIL says that the language teacher should try to look a bit more like a subject teacher, look a
Yeah.
bit more like a subject teacher, a bit like you've been talking about your Anglia school for the last two sessions. And I think also what we tried to do here, we're still trying to do in the Basque curriculum up here in the north of Spain, where I think that is definitely going on. Again, whether the teachers really like it or do it, all of them as we want, is another question.
Yeah.
But there is this. I think there is this move as well towards situations as well in language teaching, making it
Sure.
situational, making it more real as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the Common European Framework has had a hand in shaping how language teaching has evolved, certainly because of real life situations. But I think something that come to mind while you were speaking is the fact that certain countries have their undergraduates do two specialisms. So if you're a philologist,
Yeah.
you're also going to have geography, say, or if you're a geographer, you're also going to have history, say. And I
I think
think,
Austria does that now. I think Austria does that.
yeah,
It's
and Germany too
yeah,
will have kind of dual discipline
absolutely.
undergraduate courses. And that's very healthy, but it's not that widespread, I think, because the Germanic countries have it. And that helps the CLIL teacher, I think, when they find themselves in a situation where they've been asked to teach their subject through a foreign language, because they've already been thinking about some of those aspects of integrating the language and the content. But I still think it's quite rare, really, that that's a part of pre-service teacher education.
Well, I'm anticipating too much Isabella's question, but there is, I think, a breach, and I was implying that about IATEFL, between uh, what you will now read in your average European curriculum and
Mm,
what's actually going on the ground, certainly in language teaching. It might well be going on in subject teaching. I can only talk really
yeah,
with authority about what's going on in Spain, and it
of
kind
course.
of depends on the region, a little bit about the training, etc., etc.
But I would also throw in there, um, much as I love and respect IATEFL, it's not mainstream. Mainstream is run-of-the-mill schools here, run-of-the-mill schools. When I say run-of-the-mill, I just mean everyday ordinary schools and teachers.
Yeah.
IATEFL is quite a unique organization that gets a niche group of colleagues attending. I mean, I think about my own daughter's education, where she's now in her final year of a language grammar school in Bulgaria. And when she did her ab initio German, she had a vocabulary teacher, a grammar teacher, and a conversation teacher. You know what I mean? That's the way it was organized.
Yeah.
And I think, that's mainstream for many, many students and teachers and countries.
It is, although again, I insist, if you read the curricula of those countries, you'll find, I think, a kind of disassociation almost. And again, the teachers kind of get in Spain. There have been about five, six reformers since 1991 when I first came here, and so teachers get a bit cynical. I think the last reform called the LOMLOE actually is quite good, and it's very much based on Picardo, the Italian linguist, her idea of situational competencies, which she's written into the latest version of the CEFR, which I like. I think it
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense. We'll come on to that.
Those
But
two. I mean,
I,
the reality in the classroom, though, can be very different to what you and I may talk about, or what you'll
yeah,
hear and see at an IATEFL presentation. One country I wanted to mention where I have personal experience of an attempt to integrate the curriculum is Georgia. And I was involved in some trainer training in Georgia a few years ago, where the government and Ministry of Education, along with the British Council, were working on rewriting a curriculum where subject teachers and language teachers would all work under the same umbrella thematic structure.
yeah,
And my role was to bring CLIL and brainstorm and look at how CLIL can help that process.
yeah,
And what those trainers did in the first few sessions was okay. Where's the common ground? They were talking subject teacher, language teacher, mixed groups together,
nice.
maths, science, humanities, and language teachers, and they themselves came up with certain themes that they thought that they could develop and teach their subject through these themes and develop English through those themes. And I don't think it happens very much.
Well, it's like the classic picture which you put up, you inserted, didn't you, later with the frog, where the frog is the amphibian CLIL teacher, and there are the two monopedagogic teachers are on the rocks looking at the CLIL teacher sort of with a question mark, and so where you say I didn't know that about Georgia, but this looking for the common ground that's a great start to that kind of to that kind of course, trying to shift the paradigm a little bit, shift the parameters.
And
I mean,
the other thing that you and I talked about in a preamble to this was how much sense it makes for vocational education to be CLIL, because it's kind of communication plus knowing and doing things, isn't it? And so CLIL makes so much sense, and that's why it is so widespread in countries that have developed vocational education systems.
You're tempting me to come out with my famous anecdote, aren't you? From Montevideo many years ago, and I suppose it would be quite nice to repeat it. I put it in the book. in the Oxford book, no, but you know, again, what you're doing in the Anglia school seems to me to be just good practice, you know, but but you know, they're younger kids, and vocational education obviously is older kids, you know.
Yeah,
So there's
yeah.
this kind of strange idea that that doesn't need to be the same. Where I disagree with that, you know, you obviously
Exactly.
disagree with that. But
Exactly.
there's a great moment when I was talking in Montevideo. It was God, it's a while back now. It was almost 15 years, I think, and I was doing the plenary in this wonderful theatre in Montevideo, and I was going to go on, and I was sitting on front row about to go on, and there was some kind of Wi-Fi problem, usual thing, you know. So the techies started working on the Wi-Fi, and this woman turned to me, sitting next to me, a mature lady, and she said in impeccable English, she said, "I'm very glad that you're talking about CLIL because I used to be an English teacher. I'm retired now." She said, "And my grandson ran up to me the other day, and he said, Abuela, abuela, me gusta el inglés. You know, grandma, grandma, I like English. So grandma said, ¿por qué te gusta inglés? Why do you like English? And the kid said, porque hacemos cosas, because we do things, you know. It completely, not only did it change the way I did the talk 5 minutes later, you know,
Yeah, yeah.
but it actually changed the way it didn't change the way I thought because I already thought that was true, but it was just the simplicity of that boy's observation.
Absolutely.
The grandson was 8 years old. So, you know,
Yeah,
he's
that's
doing,
exactly right.
you know, so my question is the expectations of that child had been somehow broken by a teacher who was using what you might call an action-based approach, you know, an action-oriented approach, a situational approach, whatever. They were
Yeah,
doing things, you know.
yeah,
So
yeah, 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 yeah.
that might sound simple, but if you ask a language teacher, you say, all right, what does that mean? You know, what does that mean in terms of your practice? Well, it means a lot of things, you know, and we could go into it in some detail here. I mean, we can try, but you know,
Yeah,
if you're going to do things, then it means that you're making those doing things the objective. You're
I
making
think
it the
so. I think
priority,
so.
and the language comes along for the ride, as I was saying in Vietnam last week. You know,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
language comes along for the ride, and that's not. I'm not minimizing the role of language in any sense, but
yeah, yeah,
language should always come along for the ride, and you can identify that. You can identify that language that's going to come along for the ride. If you say next week we're going to use some sewing machines and work on sewing machines to make Bulgarian flags for Italian teachers, for example, you know, like you're doing. I know you're doing it yourself, but if you were to get the kids to do that, then, you know, if you
yeah,
trained a teacher to say, okay, we're going to make these flags, we're going to use these sewing machines, we're going to do this, what language is going to derive from that? But we
yeah,
haven't planned it. We haven't planned it from a linguistic objective. We've planned it
yeah,
from that, you know, doing things objective. So that's the first thing I would emphasize. If you're going to look at the shape of content, if you're going to change the way a language teacher operates, and I think it's a good way of operating, that's the
yeah.
big thing. It's the
I
objective.
think so too. I mean, with the Georgian group, I brought material with me to show examples of integration, and the now no longer live program Science Across the World was one program that brought language teachers and subject teachers together.
Yeah, it
And
did.
those materials that were produced were for the language teacher, not deep science. It was more kind of citizen science and
Yeah,
surface science, if you like. And the thing that was very interesting I think, for me as a linguist joining that program to write materials was it was a kind of an ethnographic approach to learning language. So the language was embedded within observing behaviors in society. So if you talk about domestic waste, the children would go and audit what litter they find in a garden, as we do
yeah,
here,
yeah.
and then look at the types of waste and maybe even count the waste.
That's right.
There's a wonderful website called Literati, which is literally a litter auditing website where participants go out on a litter pick, they pick up some litter, they take a picture of it, it's stuck on the website and tagged, and then it's dealt with later.
Well, that's it. That's sorry, just to interrupt, but I was in Niall in summer, and Harry Waters was there. Some people listening might know of him. You know, he's a kind of eco militant. You know, and he's woven this into his English language materials. And you know, I was sharing a campus kitchen with him. You know, and he was getting he actually got the teacher trainers. It was absolutely hammering down with rain one morning, and he had them out picking up litter around Norwich. And they were all soaking wet, and you say, well, but they all got back. But of course, he was doing exactly that. It was the ethnographic aspect of
Yeah.
of what litter. It wasn't just the shocking amount of litter they picked up. Obviously there's a quantitative aspect, but the qualitative research you can do. It's just such a simple idea, but that's what you get language teachers thinking. You say, okay, what's that? What's let's sort the litter into categories. A very simple thing. That's what a science teacher would do now. Let's sort them into categories. Let's say, how long do you think that litter's been there? Why do you think there was more litter in that part of the town than that part of the town? There's just 1,000 questions, and that just arises from a real situation. Why would you not want to do that in
It's
language?
crucially connected with behavior because in my school I frequently make bags, as you know, and we sell the bags and the kids collect the money and we donate it to charity, and frequently we do things with the children that has a knock-on effect in their own family lives. And I get feedback from parents who tell me that their 6-year-old has been on his high horse about certain aspects of their lifestyles, no more plastic bags, mummy, for example. And of course, I think I'm not saying clearly is the solution to education. But what I am saying is good language teacher CLIL is about those aspects of real life skills, and behavior is one of them.
How would the subject teacher, whoever environmental science teacher, approach the issue of litter? Well, they're kind of trained to think like that, whereas language teachers aren't. That's not a criticism, but they're not.
Yeah.
So your Georgian example, when you get them together, you say, what what are the common areas? Well, they're not maybe, but what common areas are we moving towards?
Yeah,
Well,
yeah, yeah.
I can give you a.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's the.
Your frog metaphor is wonderful because in a way what we're talking about, we're in mid-evolution, and not everybody is a frog yet, a
No.
CLIL teacher yet, but we might have part evolved frogs in the language community and part evolved frogs in the content community.
It's okay. It's okay. I mean, they're also discovering themselves. Look
Yeah,
at
I
that
think so.
professional development.
We mentioned behaviors and observation and stuff, and the Georgia project, and I mentioned taking resources there. And one of the things that you'll find if you look at the content curriculum is in data handling, whichever subject it appears in. It could be maths, could be geography, could be a science subject. Learners are expected to observe over time, collect data, record their findings, look at results of increasing complexity. They use diagrams and labels for their data. They process the data, they analyze it, they find ways of improving it, they present the data, they report on their data. And all of this stuff is immensely accessible to language teachers.
I'm not asking IATEFL to invite either you or me to give a plenary about this, but you see, but can you imagine? Can you imagine just saying what you just said, for the English language teaching world? I mean, it seems to me that whatever they're doing, and they might be doing certain things that you're talking about. I mean, the materials I was writing here which is a situational based
I'll link it.
Okay, let me just explain. I'll do it very quickly. I mean, it's very similar to what you said. One of the textbooks about it's called Healthy You, and it's for 13-year-olds and the 12, 13-year-olds. And what they have to do is they have to fill in a questionnaire about their health habits, and there are various things in their daily life, and then those go into Google Graphs. And so if you've got two classrooms, or you can use the other year or whatever, you get the data from the other class. So then you get the data from the other class, you analyze that anonymous
Yeah,
data.
yeah,
You analyze it, then you don't, you describe it, you analyze it, you draw conclusions, and then you give advice. So at the end of this long process, what the kids do is they give advice on the basis of the data to the
yeah,
other class.
yeah,
Now, I'll just go through that again. Now, if you look at what they do, they receive the data. So in a scientific process, the first thing you do is you describe data. Before you ever analyze it, you describe it. You have to describe it. You put it into, you quantify it. And again, a language teacher needs to know that, but it's not a difficult thing to understand, really. You just go back to your school days or you look it up. So you describe data. So the description of data is a certain kind of language. You know,
Yeah.
there's a certain kind of language that you need in the L1 in the native language, and you need it if you're doing English. If you're doing English to any extent, no, then they analyze the data. Okay, they analyze the data, so they probably do that in groups. Again, they'll need a certain kind of speculative language to do that. Then, having analyzed it, they draw the conclusions. You need the language of conclusions. You need the language of resolution. No? And then when they come to the fourth stage, they have to prepare this presentation with parts of the
Yeah.
data that they have to explain in terms of advice. So they need the language of advice. So that is not difficult for a language teacher.
Not at all. Not at all.
Description, analysis, conclusions, and advice. Those are four different genres, if you like, four different.
One little aside here is in a summer course I was working on, and I was talking about this to a room full of language teachers with a small group of subject teachers. And one of the language teachers said to me, put a hand up, and I said, yes, I don't like working with data.
No, I don't either. No, no, I can understand what she means, but you know,
But really,
but
I
kids
think that's
do.
because you might have a dry perspective of what data is.
Yeah,
If you talk about behavior, for example, I talk a lot in my classes here in Bulgaria about road safety because the
yeah.
data is terrible, the story of accidents and deaths on the roads in Bulgaria. So the children are part of that number, that data set.
And
And
you do that one about ice cream as well, don't you? Where you ask people about, you give them the data of the ice cream
yeah,
consumption in
yeah,
Europe or something.
exactly. I'll show that
And
as well. That's
it's
a good,
completely
that's a good
counterintuitive,
example.
isn't it? The answer
I
is
mean,
completely counterintuitive.
healthy eating is usually somewhere in a language curriculum, Phil, isn't it? But why not go a little bit further and look at, monitoring behaviors over a certain period and
Example.
seasonal changes, for example,
Yeah,
which would allow language teachers to sort of look cyclically at the way they deal with skills and language. And
yeah.
I think in a way, when we looked at sequencing last time, that was part of our discussion, wasn't it? It's kind of thinking of the bigger picture, not necessarily in terms of vocabulary and grammar, but in the skills sequencing.
Yeah, the stretching of the content, the stretching of the content over a longer period requires the teacher to think about, as you say, the procedures. And when you start thinking about the procedures, they also start to affect the kind of language that comes in. And again, you can identify those two things, content,
Yeah,
procedure, language. We keep parroting those three dimensions, but that's
yeah.
the key. It's the key for me to good language education, actually.
Yeah. Well,
So
there's another example, apart from my experience with Georgia, and you and I both have quite a lot of experience in Austria. Well, the Austrian colleagues had this program called Co-op CLIL, where they brought pairs of teachers, a language teacher and a subject teacher together
yeah,
for a period of CLIL training. And that happened for several years. And that Co-op CLIL was it was a revelation in many ways for a lot of those teachers to find out what's going on in the other person's daily life in school. And breaking stereotypes, subject teachers not expecting language teachers just to translate stuff and check stuff, which is they're never going to be frogs if they
no.
do if they have that kind of relationship.
Mm.
So I talked quite a lot with those groups when I was involved in that co-op CLIL training about taking things from each other's content areas and curriculum areas. And it always came back to the processes, Phil, that the language teacher can develop a language curriculum by kind of adopting some of the processes from the
Yes,
subject teacher's background.
completely. Completely. I think that's a great example, the litter example. One, the healthy you example yeah, as well. Yeah, it looked at various aspects of health, but I did that because obviously that meant that you could have different groups looking at different aspects when they did the feedback. But again,
So,
that makes you think about the procedure, doesn't it? You think, okay, if I
yeah.
only do it on healthy eating or something,
Yeah, yeah.
then
I mean,
it limits it a little
I
bit.
I've been moving a lot of my books from school because we closed some premises and I stored lots of things there and I moved them up to my library in my house, and I came across Moen's content and language and the knowledge framework approach to building a curriculum
Yeah, that's
is
really good.
through the thinking skills. And I think that's valid today for language. Of
That's the 1980s, Keith. I mean,
course
but
it is.
he was
Yeah.
that's right. Yeah, yeah. It's kind of it's weird that we're still talking about it now,
I
as you
mean, we might focus one of our discussions specifically on thinking skills, if you like, because I think that's a whole world of really valuable, rich content for listeners. Maybe how thinking happens in the language curriculum. It's is compartmentalized largely. There's thinking about structure, but even that, many kids don't really need an abstract knowledge of grammar. Ooh, I might be upsetting people by saying that.
I don't think it does any harm if they have it, but I think that if that's what you're hammering to 30 kids, it might do harm. I
Yeah,
don't think,
yeah,
and I don't think you're going to get 30 kids on board by doing that.
no,
I
no.
think that's the
But
problem.
if you can embrace that structural knowledge within doing other things,
Exactly, exactly.
then the understanding of it, in my opinion, is going to
Yeah.
be so much more meaningful and so much more long term.
It seems obvious to me, but let's put Isabella's question on because I think we've almost
I
answered.
think I think you're absolutely right. So
Yeah.
let's listen to a colleague's question to us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. I listened with interest, and it really got me thinking. And as my team and I, we were writing the new curricula, the upcoming curricula for languages, we are reading the CFR quite intensely. And when you have a look at the definition of an action-oriented approach for language teaching, it made me wonder, it says it should enable learners to act in real life situations. I'm reading here a little bit to express themselves, and now it comes accomplish tasks. So if you really think about it, it's also a definition of CLIL to me. But that somehow also got me thinking, will CLIL teachers now replace us as language teachers?
Does this really mean the end of the language teacher?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question and also a significant one, though. But I mean, in a sense, we have been covering a little bit, but it's interesting that she brings in the CEFR as well, and that's very interesting as well because the newest version of the CEFR I think was just before COVID, was very much influenced by the Canadian Italian, well, Picardon, Enrique Picardon, who's very big on action orientated approach that
Yeah,
Isabella mentions there, and so Isabella talks about three things now: act in real life situations, or was it express themselves, whatever that means, and accomplish tasks. Well, exactly. I mean, Isabella says that's the CLIL approach. I mean, express themselves. You see, but for me, those three things are not separate items. They're all linked in with each other, and particularly the last one where it says accomplish tasks. That's precisely what the action-oriented approach goes for. And not only that, but you're talking there about situational competencies, and so the two things get together. Now, I said at the start of this video that most European curricula now are saying that they're operating under the umbrella of situational
yes.
competencies. So
Yeah,
it
yeah,
seems to me, why would language teachers want to be somehow isolated from that? I mean, why would they not be doing that? So again, what we've been talking about here, it's not the death of the language teacher, it's the professional development of the language teacher to get on board with this sort of stuff. And I think that some are doing
very
it.
nice way of putting
I
it,
think
Phil.
I prefer language teachers to say, who watch this to come back and say, "Hey, we're doing this," and to talk about it. And I do know there is stuff going on, but
Yeah,
but it needs to be, I think, more mainstream. And so it's not the death of the language teacher at all. For me, it's the
sure.
development of the language teacher into these areas. I don't see any problem at all with language
Yeah,
teachers working on more situational. What it does mean, Keith, before you probably say the same, what it might mean is a rethinking of the way that your standard language materials are published, and
yeah.
that puts it back in the area of Cambridge, Macmillan, and Oxford, and all the big boys and
Mm,
girls, who I think a little bit wary of these approaches because obviously they would require a restructuring of the way that these textbooks or even the digital platforms are
yeah.
are constructed, and but that can be done. That can be
I
done.
think so. I mean, so in a way, we're throwing out um, a proposal, if you like, an invitation to the publishing world to rethink language published material, language learning material to respect conceptual sequencing.
Exactly. A very simple way of doing that would be instead of having 10 chapters, have 5 chapters. I don't see the difficulty, to be honest. I've done it myself, you know that. And I'm not the only person who has, but well, you have as well. And I mean, I was writing that from an official curriculum point of view. I wasn't doing it just off my own bat. But so instead of 10 chapters, I have 5. What does that mean? Those chapters are extended, the content is extended, and then you start to think about what happens when you do that. It ain't difficult. It's not rocket science, Keith.
And there are certain subject areas, aren't there, that do lend themselves to um, exploring how language could be developed in those areas, but have contexts like history, for example, like geographical information and locations and habitats, for example. And one group I worked with from Italy, we talked about the how the animal world and the human world needs to find a way to cohabit this wonderful planet. And they talked about the reintroduction of the wolves in many areas of Italy
Yeah.
becoming so successful, it's actually creating a problem for
Yes, that's right. Yes. It is
some
here as well.
communities.
In
And
Spain, it's the
that
same.
stuff, through a foreign language, is meaningful, it's contemporary, it's conceptual. And what we need is more of that exploring of those possibilities, I think, for the
Real,
language.
real life situations, I mean, I mean, again, language publishers listening to this will claim that they do that. And I would say, okay, but they do it to some extent. If you've got 10 chapters, let's go back to 10.5. If you've got 10 chapters, it's obvious to me that you
Yeah,
can't really get real life enough in 3 pages, but you might get real life enough in 6 or 7 pages and, done over a longer period. In
yeah,
terms of again the shape of content. So you get language education publishers to start thinking about the shape of content itself as well, and then
yeah.
and then you get revolution, But
I
hey,
think so too.
um,
And in a way, what we're saying, Phil, is we need some frogs in the publishing world.
yeah, absolutely. Well, there are some, but not enough. There are some. The ones that exist, I think, are not making the same amount of money as the big ones are. But it's always, ELT is a business, and that's what limits its movement somewhat. So when you go to ITEFL, as you said, you see all sorts of stuff going on, but it doesn't always seem to then retranslate into the mainstream the mainstream scene, let's say,
Yeah,
which is always dominated by, Cambridge exams, all the rest of it. I'm not
yeah.
saying we can eradicate or get rid of that. It has its function,
No,
but
no. But
I,
personally, I prepare students for Cambridge exams. But what I do is I teach them exactly what's expected. I don't do a whole course through a course book. I help them see through the different parts they're going to sit down and do exactly what they need to be ready for and with. We do, topic vocabulary as well and grammatical structure, but it's all within the skills they need to get through that exam. And I don't think you need, a year and a half course to go through
no, that's my argument as well. I mean, it's a one we could talk about maybe in a subsequent one. Whether the CLIL approaches, as Isabella was saying, what she said was that sounds to me like a CLIL curriculum, let's say, a CLIL program.
yeah,
Not quite the same thing, but a CLIL program. But I would say that, well, yeah, okay, but that's also sounds to me like a good language curriculum and
yeah,
or
yeah.
a language program. No? Well, I don't know if you wanted to also just chip in about what Isabella said there, Keith, but
No, I agree with everything you said, and I think to a certain extent, the status quo is not likely to change unless there are factors influencing that status quo. At the moment, it really is the publishing world that really leads to what happens in the classroom. I mean, even the conference world, I think, has less of an influence on the everyday teaching and learning experiences in most schools. But the publishing world, national publishing, authorized books, for example, through Ministry of Education, they influence how and what goes on in classrooms. And until we have frogs in the publishing world writing what we're talking about, and just to repeat, the frog is a CLIL experienced practitioner. Just to say that, I don't want people to come and think we're talking about reptiles and stuff here. Um, But I think in a way we're still niche. We're very niche, but we can make as much noise as we like in this environment.
Well, we're niche, but again, according to what Isabella said, perhaps we're not. You know, because if you're reading the CFR, that's that's what language teaching is supposed to be doing, you know, or at least it's supposed to be dedicating some time to it. I don't, maybe the action-oriented approach can't be done through the whole year, but that's the way to start. You know, I was in Vietnam last week and I was saying this, you know, if you want to start CLILing, if you want to start getting towards somewhere towards a bilingual system, you know, that's a long way off, obviously, but that's what you would do. You start small, you know, you start small. You find a subject teacher who can do a bit of that in language, and then you get the language teacher on board, you know. You don't need to start bang like that with everybody doing it. It's
But maybe
gradual.
those opportunities that colleagues need is to be able to sit down with a language teacher, with a subject teacher to get their their curricula out and
Yep,
look at the common areas
yep,
and then decide what each can do in their comfort zones, basically.
yep.
And then we actually begin to tie up and join up the curriculum in a meaningful way.
I like
Up
it.
there, my buzzer went off, and I
Yeah.
think we've got a few themes that we can actually pull out for a future discussion, Phil.
Yeah.
Thinking skills we mentioned, how to join up the curriculum. That would be a big question to deal
I was
with.
about to say the bridging thing that you talked about from the council in the Madrid. That's a good one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Bridging the curriculum. That's a
Okay.
very interesting one. Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
Okay. I'll stop the recording and I'll say cheerio to the listeners and viewers and look forward to next time.
yeah.